They say the quietest people in the room are usually the ones who could buy it. I want you to remember that line, because by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why it matters. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 63 years old, and for most of my life, I have been underestimated. I was underestimated by my late husband's business partners, back when we were young and had nothing but a handshake and 3 old trucks. I was underestimated by a bank manager who once told me, to my face, that I didn't look like someone who ran a company. And I was underestimated, most painfully of all, by my own son-in-law. His name is Cole Bennett. He married my daughter Marissa 4 years ago, in a wedding that cost more than most people's houses. And from the very first day I met him, he looked at me the way you look at something you've stepped in by accident. Something to be scraped off quietly, without much thought given to what it actually was. To him, I was just Marissa's mother. The woman in the plain cardigan. The woman who drove a 12-year-old truck with mud still on the tires. The woman who brought homemade bread to family dinners instead of a bottle of wine that cost more than my truck's monthly gas bill. He never asked what I did for a living. He never asked how I had raised 3 children alone after my husband passed. He never once looked past the surface long enough to ask a single real question about who I was, where I'd come from, or what I had built with my own 2 hands. If he had asked, even once, he would have learned something that would have changed the way he spoke to me for the rest of his life. But he never asked. And that small, arrogant mistake, the mistake of never asking, is the reason this story exists. This is the story of the night Cole Bennett stood in front of 40 guests at his own wedding anniversary and called me, in so many words, a burden his wife had learned to carry. This is the story of what happened 3 weeks later, when the truth about who really owned everything in his life came pouring out, in front of the very same people who had laughed at his joke. And this is the story of what I learned about my daughter, about myself, and about the quiet, dangerous mistake of judging a person by the coat they wear instead of the ground they actually stand on. Stay with me until the end. Because what happened that night, nobody in that room expected, not even me. Let me take you back further than that party. Let me tell you who I really was, long before Cole Bennett ever learned my name. I grew up on a small farm 2 hours outside of town, the kind of place where you learn to work before you learn to read properly. My father taught me how to read a balance sheet before I was 10 years old, sitting across from him at our kitchen table with a stack of yellow ledger paper and a stubby pencil worn down to almost nothing. "Numbers don't lie, Ellie," he used to tell me, tapping the paper with one thick, calloused finger. "People lie. People dress things up, and people talk themselves into believing whatever makes them feel important. But numbers just sit there and tell you the truth, whether you like it or not." I carried that lesson with me my whole life, long after my father was gone. I married young, to a man named Richard Hayes, a quiet, steady man who believed in building things slowly, brick by brick, and never showing off what you had. We met at a county fair of all places, both of us covered in dust from helping our families load cattle trailers. He didn't try to impress me. He just handed me a bottle of water and asked if I needed a hand. And something about the plainness of that offer told me everything I needed to know about him. Together, Richard and I built a small trucking and logistics company from almost nothing. 3 old, rattling trucks and a handshake agreement with a local grain co-op that trusted us because we showed up on time, every time, no matter the weather. We worked 18-hour days for the first 5 years. We didn't take vacations. We didn't buy anything we couldn't pay for outright. By the time Richard passed away 12 years ago, from a heart condition that took him far too soon, that small company had grown into something neither of us could have imagined, as 2 young people stacking crates in a cold barn before sunrise. But here is the thing about Richard and me. We never changed how we lived, even as the company grew larger than we ever expected. We kept driving old trucks. We kept our house small and modest, the same one we'd bought in our 20s. We invested quietly and carefully in real estate, in farmland, in a handful of local businesses that needed a partner who believed in them before anyone else did. And we never once told our neighbors, our friends, or even most of our extended family exactly what those investments had grown into. By the time Richard died, we were worth far more than most people in our town would ever have guessed by looking at us. And I kept it that way on purpose, even after he was gone. I didn't want people treating me differently. I didn't want my children growing up thinking that money made them better than the people around them. I wanted them to understand the value of honest work, the same way my father had taught me, sitting at that kitchen table with his ledger paper and his stubby pencil. So when my daughter Marissa brought home a sharp-dressed young man named Cole Bennett, I didn't sit him down and explain what I was worth. I didn't think I needed to. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that character should matter more than a bank statement, and that if Cole was a decent man, he would come to know and respect me for who I was, not for what I had. I was wrong about one very important thing. I assumed Cole would eventually see who I was, given enough time. He never did. Not once, in 4 years of marriage to my daughter, did Cole Bennett ask me a single meaningful question about my life before Marissa was born, about the company Richard and I had built, or about the years I'd spent as a widow raising 3 children largely on my own. He assumed. He assumed the moment he saw my truck, my plain clothes, my simple house, and he never once revisited that assumption. And assuming, I have learned over the course of a long life, is the most expensive mistake a person can ever make. From the outside, in those early days, Cole Bennett looked like everything a mother could want for her daughter. He was tall, well-spoken, always dressed sharply, even for casual family dinners. He drove a car that cost more than my house had when Richard and I first bought it. He talked, often and at length, about his real estate portfolio and his investment strategy, usually loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, as though repetition alone could make something more true. Marissa met him at a work conference downtown. She came home glowing that night, talking about how confident he was, how he seemed to know exactly what he wanted out of life, how different he was from the quiet, uncertain young men she'd dated before. I remember sitting across from her at my kitchen table, the same table my father once used to teach me about ledgers, and watching my daughter's face light up as she described him. "He's just so sure of himself, Mom," she said. "He knows exactly where he's going." I smiled and told her I was happy for her, and I meant it. I wanted more than anything for my daughter to find someone who would build a life with her the way Richard and I had built ours, slowly, honestly, together. I didn't yet know that sure of himself and honest are not always the same thing. Cole proposed within 8 months of their first date, in a lavish, very public gesture at a restaurant downtown, complete with a string quartet he'd hired for the occasion. Marissa said yes, overwhelmed and thrilled. I remember feeling, even then, a small flicker of unease, not because the gesture was too much, but because it felt performed, as if it had been staged as much for the other diners watching as for Marissa herself. I told myself I was being an overly cautious mother. I told myself that some men simply express love through grand gestures, and that this didn't mean anything was wrong. The wedding, 6 months later, was enormous. A private venue, an open bar that ran until 2 in the morning, a band flown in from out of state. Cole's family paid for most of it, and Cole made sure, more than once that evening, to mention exactly how much certain elements of the wedding had cost. I remember standing near the edge of the dance floor that night, in a simple pale blue dress I'd bought years earlier for another occasion, watching my daughter dance with her new husband, feeling the particular ache that every mother feels on her child's wedding day, pride and worry, tangled together in a knot I couldn't quite loosen. Cole approached me near the end of the night, drink in hand, and said, with what I now understand was the first small test of many, "Eleanor, I promise you, Marissa is never going to have to worry about money again." I thanked him. I told him that was kind of him to say. What I did not tell him, what I chose in that moment not to reveal, was that Marissa had never once had to worry about money in her entire life, and that the reason she hadn't was not because of anything Cole had yet done, but because of 35 years of quiet, careful work that Richard and I had done long before Cole Bennett ever walked into a conference room downtown. I kept that to myself. I have wondered many times since whether that silence, well-intentioned as it was, made the years that followed harder than they needed to be. The first time I truly understood how Cole saw me was at Marissa's 30th birthday party, almost 2 years into their marriage. I had brought a gift, a small wooden box that had belonged to my grandmother, filled carefully with old photographs of Marissa as a little girl, her first day of school, her 10th birthday, the summer she'd broken her arm falling out of the old oak tree behind our farmhouse. It wasn't an expensive gift. It was priceless in a different way, the kind of gift that only a mother who had lived every one of those moments could ever give. Cole opened it in front of everyone gathered in the living room, glanced inside for a brief moment, and set it down on the side table without a word, already reaching for his own gift bag. Then he pulled out his gift for Marissa, a car, wrapped in a ridiculous oversized bow, parked in the driveway where everyone could see it clearly through the front window. Gasps and applause rippled through the room. Marissa's hands flew to her mouth in surprise, and then Cole turned, smiling, and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "You know, some of us give gifts that mean something, and some of us give gifts that actually do something." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room, the nervous kind of laughter people give when they aren't entirely sure if a joke was really meant to be a joke, or something sharper wearing a joke's clothing. Marissa didn't laugh. She looked across the room at me, her face flushing red with embarrassment, and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," silently, as though she somehow owed me an apology for her own husband's words. I didn't say anything that night. I smiled, thanked Cole for the joke, and quietly slipped the wooden box back into my bag before I left. I told myself he was young, insecure, perhaps trying too hard to prove something to a room full of people he wanted to impress. I told myself it would pass, the way most rough edges smooth out over time in a marriage. It did not pass. Over the following months, it grew steadily worse. Over the next 2 years, the comments became a pattern, one that repeated itself with such consistency that I eventually stopped being surprised by it and simply began bracing myself for it before every family gathering. At dinners, Cole would go around the table asking everyone about their financial goals for the year, a habit he seemed to have picked up from some seminar or business book. And he would skip right over me entirely, as though it had never occurred to him that I might have goals worth discussing at all. At holiday gatherings, he made a habit of commenting on my truck, parked outside in whatever driveway we happened to be gathered at. "Still driving that old thing, Eleanor?" he'd say, shaking his head with a small laugh, as though the truck itself were evidence of some deeper personal failing. He commented on my clothes. Always plain, always practical, the same cardigans and simple dresses I'd worn for years, because they were comfortable and because I had never seen the point in spending money on things that didn't need replacing. He commented on my simple little life, out on the edge of town, in the same modest house Richard and I had bought decades earlier, as though a smaller house automatically meant a smaller existence. Every single comment, on its own, could be dismissed as harmless teasing. That was the cruelty of it. No single comment was ever quite enough to justify confrontation, but together, over months and years, they formed a steady drumbeat that slowly, quietly, reshaped how everyone at the table saw me. What hurt the most, far more than any comment directed at me personally, was watching my daughter shrink a little more with every joke he made at my expense. Marissa had always been sharp, confident, quick with a comeback since she was a little girl. But slowly, over those 2 years, I watched her start apologizing for things that weren't her fault. Apologizing for me. Apologizing for herself. Apologizing, it seemed, simply for existing in a way that occasionally inconvenienced her husband's carefully constructed image. I remember one evening in particular, after a birthday dinner where Cole had made an especially cutting comment about how I must have really struggled to help pay for Marissa's college tuition. A comment that conveniently ignored the fact that I had paid for her entire 4 years without a single loan. Marissa called me late that night, crying. "I don't know why he does this," she said, her voice thick with tears. "He's not like this with his own family. He's not like this with his friends. It's only ever you, Mom. That should have told me something important right then. But I still believed, foolishly, that this was simply a rough patch in an otherwise solid marriage. The kind of friction every couple faces as they learn to blend two very different families together. I did not yet understand that Cole Bennett's confidence, the swagger he wore so easily in every room he entered, wasn't built on genuine success. It was built on appearances, on borrowed money, and on borrowed time. And people who build their entire identity on things that aren't real often need someone smaller to stand next to make themselves feel taller by comparison. I had unknowingly become that person for him. And I didn't yet know it, because he made very, very sure that no one, least of all me, ever looked closely enough to see the truth underneath. There is one particular dinner from that second year that I still think about often, because in hindsight, it was the clearest warning sign I ever chose to ignore. It was a Sunday dinner at my house, the kind we'd held every few weeks for years, long before Cole ever entered the picture. My son Daniel had driven up from the city with his wife, and my youngest, Grace, had come home from college for the weekend. The table was full, the way I liked it, with too much food and too much noise, and everyone talking over each other the way families do. Cole arrived late, as he often did, and made a point of mentioning, within the first 5 minutes of sitting down, that he'd just come from closing a deal on a strip mall property 2 towns over. He described the square footage, the projected returns, the tenant he was supposedly already in talks with. A whole detailed story, delivered with the easy confidence of a man reciting something rehearsed. Daniel, who worked in commercial finance himself, asked a few genuine, curious questions about the deal. What bank was financing it? What the cap rate looked like? Who the seller was? I remember watching Cole's face carefully as the questions came. His answers grew vaguer with each one. He mentioned a private lender without naming them. He said the numbers were still being finalized. He changed the subject within a few minutes, turning the conversation instead toward asking Daniel about his own work, flattering him at length until the moment had passed. At the time, I told myself Cole was simply being cautious, protecting sensitive business details from casual dinner conversation. It's only in hindsight, once Harold's research came back months later, that I understood what I'd actually witnessed that evening. A man improvising a story in real time, adjusting it moment to moment based on how closely anyone happened to be listening. Later that same dinner, Cole turned to me, as he so often did, and asked, with a small, knowing smile, "So, Eleanor, any big plans for that truck of yours? Might be time to think about an upgrade, don't you think?" I told him simply that the truck ran fine and that I saw no reason to replace something that still worked. "Some people just don't like change," he said to the table, shaking his head with a soft laugh, and a few people chuckled politely along with him. Grace, my youngest, spoke up before I could respond. "Or maybe Grandma just doesn't need to prove anything to anyone," she said flatly, not laughing. The table went quiet for a beat. Cole's smile faltered slightly, and he moved the conversation along quickly to something else. I remember feeling, in that small moment, a flicker of gratitude toward my youngest daughter for saying aloud something I had chosen, for years, not to say myself. I wish now that I had listened more closely to that flicker. Children often see clearly what adults have trained themselves to overlook. It was my old friend Diane who first planted the seed of doubt that would eventually grow into everything that followed. Diane and I had been friends since our children were in grade school together, decades of friendship built on shared coffee mornings, shared worries about teenagers, and later, shared grief when both our husbands passed within 2 years of each other. She worked at the regional bank in town, the same bank as it happened, where Cole conducted much of his personal and business banking. We met for coffee one gray Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, at the same small diner we'd been meeting at for almost 20 years. Diane seemed distracted that day, stirring her coffee longer than necessary, glancing at me a few times as if deciding whether to say something. Finally, she set her spoon down and looked at me directly. "Eleanor," she said slowly, choosing her words with obvious care, I probably shouldn't say anything. It's not really my place. But be careful with that son-in-law of yours. Things aren't always what they look like. I asked her gently what she meant by that. She shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. I can't say more than that. There are rules about what I can and can't discuss, even with a friend. But Eleanor, be careful. That's all I'll say. I respected Diane too much to push her further, knowing the position it would put her in professionally. But I carried her words home with me that evening, turning them over and over in my mind, the way you turn over a stone looking for something hidden underneath. I started paying closer attention after that conversation. Small things I had previously dismissed without a second thought began to look different in the new light Diane's warning had cast over them. Cole's real estate portfolio, the one he loved to describe in such elaborate detail at every family dinner, seemed, now that I listened more carefully, to always be described in future tense. I'm about to close on a property downtown. I'm in talks for a development deal that's going to change everything. Never once, I realized, had he said simply, I own. It was always I'm about to. Always some deal on the horizon, forever just out of reach, forever almost real. His car, the one he flaunted so proudly at every gathering, I later learned through an offhand comment Marissa made one evening, was leased rather than owned outright. Nothing inherently wrong with leasing a vehicle, of course, but it did not match the story he told so confidently to everyone else. And most tellingly of all, I began to notice a pattern in how money moved through their household. Every single time finances got tight, and it happened more often than Marissa ever let on to me directly. It was quietly, consistently, my daughter's steady income that covered the gap. Marissa worked as a school administrator, a stable but modest salary. Yet somehow, month after month, she was the one covering the mortgage payment while Cole was, in his own words, between deals. I didn't confront anyone about any of this. Not yet. I am my father's daughter, after all, and he taught me that numbers tell the truth eventually, if you are patient enough to wait for them. So I waited. I watched. And quietly, without telling a single soul what I was doing, I began to look a little more closely into the life of the man who had, for 2 years now, called my gifts worthless and my truck an embarrassment in front of everyone we knew. I want to be clear about something, because it matters a great deal to me that you understand my intentions correctly. I did not go digging into Cole's finances out of spite or jealousy or some petty desire to prove myself right. I went looking because I was genuinely afraid for my daughter, and a mother's fear, I have come to believe, is one of the most powerful and clarifying forces in the world. Through a contact I trusted completely, a retired accountant named Harold, who had worked alongside Richard and me for nearly 3 decades and still quietly helped me manage our holdings even after his official retirement, I began piecing together the shape of Cole Bennett's actual finances, using nothing but public records, court filings, and small details Marissa herself had unknowingly shared with me over the years without realizing their significance. The picture that slowly emerged over the following weeks was staggering, and far worse than even Diane's careful warning had prepared me for. Cole's investment company, the one he described so confidently at every family gathering, had no meaningful assets behind it at all. It functioned, in practice, as little more than a shell used to justify a lifestyle he could not otherwise explain or afford. The car, as I'd already learned, was leased. The downtown condo he had once bragged about owning outright still carried a mortgage larger than the property's current market value, meaning that if he sold it tomorrow, he would owe money rather than walk away with anything. 2 business partners he frequently mentioned by name at dinners, men he described as close friends and trusted colleagues, had, in fact, quietly and permanently cut ties with him the previous year over unpaid debts totaling nearly $200,000. And most disturbing of all, the detail that finally moved me from quiet concern to decisive action. Harold discovered that Cole had, on at least 2 separate occasions, used Marissa's name and credit history, without ever fully disclosing the details to her, to secure loans that were now falling significantly behind on their payments. My daughter did not know the full extent of any of this. She knew, in a vague and worried way, that money was tight sometimes. She did not know that she was co-signed, in ways she barely understood or remembered agreeing to, on financial obligations that could one day collapse on top of her, damaging her credit, threatening her financial future, possibly even putting her modest savings and her home at risk. Harold worked carefully and methodically over nearly 3 weeks to build the full picture, always cautious to use only legitimate, publicly available sources: county property records, court filings from the dissolved business partnerships, and information Marissa herself had unknowingly shared with me in passing conversation over the years. At no point did we access anything private or improperly obtained. Everything Harold found was, technically, available to anyone willing to spend the time looking. That, in some ways, was the most sobering part of the whole discovery. Cole had not committed some elaborate, sophisticated fraud that required special access to uncover. He had simply counted, correctly, on the fact that no one in the family would ever bother to look. He had counted on the assumption that a plain, quiet woman in a cardigan wouldn't know how to read a property filing or understand a business dissolution notice. He had counted, in other words, on the very same underestimation he practiced on me at every dinner table. Harold called me late one evening, near the end of the 3rd week, his voice careful and measured in the way it always was when he had something difficult to report. "Eleanor," he said, "I think you need to sit down for this next part." He walked me through the loan documentation slowly, line by line. 2 separate loans, taken out 18 months apart, both listing Marissa as a co-signer, both showing her signature on the paperwork. When I asked Harold whether it was possible Marissa had simply forgotten signing these documents, given how much paperwork accumulates in any marriage, he was quiet for a moment before answering. "It's possible," he said carefully. "But Eleanor, one of these loans was taken out entirely online, through a lender that doesn't require in-person signing. The signature was submitted electronically. I'm not in a position to say for certain what your daughter did or didn't understand about what she was agreeing to, but I can tell you the loan exists. It's several months behind on payments, and her name and credit are attached to it." I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night for a long time after hanging up the phone, staring at the same worn wood surface where my father had once taught me to read a ledger, feeling a kind of quiet, cold fury I had not experienced in many years. I sat with that information for 3 full days before I decided what to do next. I barely slept during those 3 nights, lying awake in the dark, thinking of my daughter's face at that first birthday party, mouthing, "I'm sorry," across the room for something that was never her fault to begin with. I could have confronted Cole directly, in private, sitting him down at my own kitchen table and laying out everything Harold had found. Some part of me wanted to do exactly that, to give him the chance to explain himself, to correct course, to become a better husband to my daughter before things went any further. But I had watched Cole Bennett operate for 4 years by then, and I understood something important about men like him. Men who build their entire identity on appearances do not respond well to quiet, private conversations. They deny, they deflect, they find ways to make the person confronting them feel unreasonable or paranoid or cruel for even asking the question. A private conversation would have given Cole exactly the kind of controlled environment he thrived in. A room where he could manage the narrative, minimize the details, and eventually convince my daughter that I was simply overreacting, or worse, that I was trying to interfere in her marriage out of some petty resentment. I needed my daughter to see the truth clearly, undeniably, in a way she could never later doubt, minimize, or excuse away in the quiet hours of the night when love makes people forgive things they shouldn't. So I made a decision that would change everything that followed. I decided that the truth would not come from me in a private conversation, easily denied and reframed. It would come out in public, in the exact kind of room Cole loved to perform in front of the exact kind of audience he had always been most desperate to impress. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to pause and tell you something I only came to understand much later, after everything had already come apart. I want to tell you a little about where Cole Bennett actually came from, because it explains, without excusing, a great deal about who he became. Cole did not grow up wealthy, despite the image he worked so hard to project. Harold's research, and later, quiet conversations with Cole's own mother during the difficult months that followed, revealed that Cole had grown up in a modest household, not so different from my own. A father who worked long hours in a mid-level sales job, a mother who took in bookkeeping work from small local businesses to help make ends meet. But somewhere along the way, likely in his teenage years, Cole had absorbed a very different lesson than the one my father had taught me at our kitchen table. Where my father told me that numbers tell the truth, Cole appeared to have learned, from wherever a young man learns such things, that appearances create their own kind of truth, that if you look successful long enough, loudly enough, and confidently enough, people will eventually stop asking questions and simply believe you. For a long time, this strategy seemed to work for him. He climbed quickly through a series of sales and marketing jobs in his 20s, always managing to look one step further ahead than he actually was, always managing to secure the next opportunity before anyone looked too closely at the last one. By the time he met Marissa, he had built an entire persona around confidence and success, one that had, until that point, never truly been tested. I don't say any of this to excuse what he did. The loans taken in my daughter's name without her full understanding, the years of casual cruelty directed at me across countless family dinners. Those were his choices, made by a grown man who knew better, and he alone bears responsibility for them. But I do think it matters to understand that Cole's need to diminish me wasn't really about me at all. It was never truly about my truck, or my cardigan, or my quiet little house. It was about a man who had built his entire sense of self-worth on a foundation of appearances, standing next to a woman who had built something real and lasting without ever needing anyone to notice. On some level, I believe, my quiet contentment threatened him more than any direct criticism ever could have. It was easier for him to mock what he assumed I lacked than to sit with the discomfort of what I actually had, without ever announcing it. Understanding this, in the months after everything came apart, did not make the years of comments hurt any less in hindsight. But it did help me let go of any lingering anger toward him more quickly than I otherwise might have. Pity, I have found, is a far lighter thing to carry than resentment. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Cole and Marissa's 4th wedding anniversary was approaching, and Cole's parents had offered to host a celebration at their large lakeside property. Nearly 40 guests invited, including family, close friends, and notably, several of Cole's business associates, the very people he most wanted to impress with talk of deals and portfolios. I almost didn't go. Part of me, tired after 4 years of quiet humiliation, wanted nothing more than to protect myself from another evening of pointed comments and uncomfortable laughter. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing bank records and legal filings with Harold, understood that I needed to be there, and that this particular evening, of all evenings, could not happen without me present. Before the party, I made 2 important phone calls, each one carefully considered. The first call was to my longtime attorney and financial advisor, a sharp, precise woman named Patricia Coleman, who had handled Richard's and my affairs for over 20 years and understood our family history better than almost anyone outside of it. I asked her to prepare documentation, not to destroy Cole publicly, not out of any desire for cruelty, but simply to have the truth clearly organized and ready, should the moment call for it. Patricia listened carefully as I explained everything Harold had found. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Eleanor," she said, "are you certain you want to do this in public? Once information like this comes out in front of people, you can't take it back." "I know," I told her. "But I've watched my daughter apologize for herself for 4 years, because a man convinced everyone in that family that appearances were the only thing that mattered. I want her to see, undeniably, in front of everyone who has ever laughed along with his jokes, exactly what those appearances were actually built on." Patricia agreed to prepare everything I needed and to attend the party herself as my guest, ready to speak to the documentation professionally and factually, without embellishment, if the moment came. The second call I made was to my daughter, and this one was far harder than the first. I did not tell her everything I knew. I could not risk her confronting Cole prematurely, before the documentation was fully prepared, and more importantly, I did not want to force her hand, or take away her own agency in whatever came next. Instead, I simply told her, over the phone, in the gentlest voice I could manage, "Marissa, I love you, and no matter what happens at this party, I want you to remember that you are stronger than you think, and that you are not alone. You have never been alone." She laughed softly, a little confused. "Mom, you're being very dramatic. It's just an anniversary party." I let her believe that. She had no idea what was coming. And in some ways, I think that innocence was the last gift I could give her, before everything changed. The night of the party, I dressed carefully. Not in anything flashy, not in anything that would draw attention before the moment was right, but in a simple navy dress I'd owned for years, paired with the same plain cardigan I always wore to family gatherings. I wanted, more than anything, to look exactly the way Cole expected me to look. Quiet, unremarkable, easy to overlook. Because sometimes, I have learned, the most powerful thing a person can do is let someone underestimate them one final time before the truth changes everything. I arrived carrying a small folder in my bag, tucked carefully beneath my wallet and a pack of tissues, as though it were nothing more than ordinary paperwork. Patricia had prepared it meticulously over the preceding week. Copies of public property records, loan documentation bearing Marissa's name and signature, correspondence regarding the dissolved business partnerships, and a simple, factual summary letter outlining everything Harold and Patricia had uncovered together. I hoped, even then, some small part of me hoped, that I would not need to open that folder at all. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Cole might surprise everyone and behave with basic decency for one single evening, that some instinct of restraint might finally kick in after 4 years of increasingly bold comments. He did not surprise me. Not even a little. The lakeside property was beautifully decorated for the occasion. String lights woven through the trees along the water's edge, long tables set with white linens, a small band playing softly near the patio. Cole's parents had clearly spared no expense, and Cole himself moved through the gathering crowd with his usual easy confidence, shaking hands, laughing loudly at his own jokes, introducing his business associates to one another with elaborate, exaggerated descriptions of each person's professional accomplishments. I sat quietly near the edge of the patio for most of the early evening, sipping a glass of water, watching my daughter move through the crowd beside her husband, smiling politely at guests she barely knew, playing the role of the perfect wife with the same practiced grace she'd been perfecting for 4 years. Patricia arrived separately, dressed elegantly but understatedly, and found a seat near me without drawing attention. We exchanged only a brief, quiet nod. She knew, as I did, that the evening would unfold on its own terms, in its own time. We did not have to wait very long. The party was in full swing by the time Cole stood up near the head table to give his anniversary toast, glass of expensive champagne in hand, his watch catching the light from the string lights overhead as he raised his arm for attention. The music faded. Conversations quieted. All eyes turned toward him, exactly the way he liked it. He began, as he so often did on these occasions, talking about his journey, his business success, his growing property holdings, his vision for the future he and Marissa were building together. The room listened, some guests nodding along politely, others already familiar enough with Cole's speaking style to simply wait patiently for him to finish. And then, as he had done so many times before, at so many family gatherings over the years, he turned his attention toward me. "You know," he said, smiling warmly at the gathered guests, gesturing casually toward where I sat quietly near the edge of the patio. "I used to worry, back when I first started dating Marissa, when she told me her mom drove an old truck and lived in that little house outside of town. I thought to myself, is this really what I'm marrying into?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through parts of the crowd. The nervous kind, the kind people offer when they aren't entirely certain whether a joke is truly meant kindly or not. But you know what I learned? He continued, warming to his own story, clearly enjoying the attention of the room. Family isn't about what you have, it's about showing up, even if you don't have very much to show up with. He raised his glass toward me then, smiling broadly, as though this were somehow meant as a genuine compliment. So here's to Eleanor, the woman who taught my wife that a little humility goes a long way. The room clapped politely, some guests smiling warmly, apparently interpreting his words as a sincere, if clumsy, tribute. Marissa's face, however, had gone pale beside him. I saw her hands grip the edge of the white tablecloth tightly, her knuckles going white. I could have simply stood up in that moment, quietly humiliated, and left the party altogether, the way I had done, metaphorically, if not literally, so many times over the previous 4 years. That is exactly what Cole expected of me. That is exactly what he had trained the entire room to expect from me. Quiet, dignified retreat, followed by polite silence. Instead, I smiled, the same calm, steady smile I had worn through every single insult over the past 4 years. And I stood up slowly from my seat. "Cole," I said, my voice steady, carrying easily across the now quiet patio. "Thank you for that toast. It means a great deal, coming from a man who understands financial success so well." A few guests chuckled softly, assuming, quite reasonably, that I was simply being gracious in return. "In fact," I continued, reaching down for the small bag beside my chair, "since we're already talking about financial success tonight, I brought something with me that I think everyone here might find genuinely interesting." I straightened, folder now in hand, and looked directly at Cole across the quiet patio. The room went very, very still. "I want to be clear about something before I say anything further," I began, holding the folder in both hands but not yet opening it, letting my words settle over the silent gathering first. "I don't do this out of spite, and I don't do this to embarrass anyone for the simple pleasure of it. I do this because my daughter deserves the truth, clearly and undeniably, and so, frankly, does everyone in this room who has trusted Cole with their money, their business partnerships, or their friendship over these past several years." Cole's confident smile faltered for the very first time in 4 years of knowing him. "Eleanor, what exactly is this?" "This," I said calmly, opening the folder just enough to reveal the neatly organized documents inside, "is public record, property filings, loan documentation, business dissolution notices, all things anyone in this room could find themselves if they simply knew where to look and knew which questions to ask." I looked directly at him, my voice steady, carrying no anger, only clarity. "You've spent 4 years telling this family, and apparently this entire room tonight, that I don't understand financial success. So let's talk about financial success, Cole. Let's talk about the downtown condo you have described, at length, as something you own outright. A condo which, according to public county records, actually carries a mortgage larger than the property's current market value." Gasps moved quietly through parts of the crowd. Several of Cole's business associates, seated near the back tables, exchanged uncomfortable sideways glances with one another. "Let's talk," I continued, "about your investment company, the one you've described in such detail at every family dinner for 4 years, which, as it turns out, holds no meaningful assets at all. Let's talk about the 2 business partnerships you frequently mention by name, which dissolved completely last year over unpaid debts." Cole's face had gone visibly pale by this point, his champagne glass lowering slowly to the table. "This is not the place to discuss this, Eleanor." "And let's talk," I said, my voice remaining calm but firmer now, "about the loans taken out using my daughter's name and credit history without her full understanding of what she was actually signing." Marissa's hand flew to her mouth beside him, her eyes wide with shock. "Cole, is that true? What is she talking about?" Cole's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any words at all. You made my daughter's mother into a joke at your own wedding anniversary, in front of 40 guests, I said, turning to address the gathered crowd directly now. I think this is exactly the place for this conversation. I paused, letting the silence stretch across the patio for a long moment, the only sound the soft lapping of the lake water against the shore below. I'm not here to destroy anyone tonight, I continued, my voice softening slightly, though it lost none of its steadiness. I'm here because for 4 years, I sat quietly through comments about my simple little life, from a man who, as it turns out, doesn't actually own the condo he describes so proudly, hasn't turned an honest profit from his so-called investment company in over 2 years, and has quietly put my daughter's financial future at risk without ever telling her the full truth of what he was doing. I turned to address the room more broadly, my eyes moving across the stunned, silent faces watching me. My husband and I built a logistics and real estate company from 3 old trucks and a handshake agreement, over 35 years of honest, quiet work. We never advertised what it eventually became, because we never believed that money should determine how people treat one another. But since apparently, in this particular family, financial success has become the measuring stick for basic respect, I think it's time everyone here understood exactly who they've actually been disrespecting for 4 years. I nodded toward Patricia, who rose calmly from her seat and stepped forward beside me. With my permission, and speaking only in factual professional terms, without embellishment or exaggeration, she briefly confirmed for the gathered guests the general scale of the business and property holdings that Richard and I had built together over 3.5 decades. One of Cole's business associates, a man I later learned ran a mid-sized commercial development firm 2 counties over, stood slowly from his table, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor Hayes," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Hayes Logistics and Land. I've heard that name for years. I didn't realize you were—" He stopped himself, glancing at Cole, then back at me. I had no idea there was a connection. "There wasn't meant to be one you'd notice," I said simply. "That was rather the point, for most of my life." Cole, finding some of his composure again, tried one more time. "Eleanor, whatever you think you've found, there are explanations for all of this. Business is complicated. Numbers don't always tell the whole story." "Numbers tell exactly the whole story, Cole," I said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "That's the one thing they're actually very good at. It's people who complicate things. It's people who tell one story at the dinner table and let a very different story sit quietly in a county filing office, hoping no one ever bothers to compare the two." Marissa, still seated, spoke up then, her voice trembling but clear enough for the whole patio to hear. "Cole, did you use my name on a loan without telling me?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation, everyone at the party had their answer before he ever opened his mouth. "I was going to tell you once things stabilized," he finally said. "I didn't want you to worry." "You didn't want me to know," Marissa said quietly. "There's a difference." It was not about bragging, and it never had been. It was about the truth, finally standing exactly where the lies had lived comfortably for far too long. For what felt like a very long time, nobody at that party said a single word. Cole stood frozen near the head table, his champagne glass still in hand, his face somewhere between disbelief and dawning panic as he began to understand, in real time, exactly how thoroughly his carefully constructed image had just come apart in front of the very people he had spent years trying hardest to impress. His business associates were the first to move. 2 men near the back tables stood quietly, exchanged a brief word with each other, and simply left the party without saying goodbye to Cole at all, their expressions unreadable, but their departure speaking volumes on its own. A third approached me cautiously on his way out, lowering his voice as he passed. "Ma'am," he said, "I run a small logistics firm 2 counties over. I had no idea about any of this. I'm sorry you were spoken to that way." I thanked him quietly, and he continued on his way. Cole's parents, who had spent considerable money hosting the evening, stood near the patio doors in visible shock, clearly struggling to reconcile the son they thought they knew with the picture I had just laid out in careful, documented detail. Marissa did not move at all for several long moments. She simply sat at the head table, staring at the folder still in my hands, her face cycling through disbelief, hurt, and something that looked almost like relief. The particular relief of finally understanding something that had confused and hurt her for a very long time. "Marissa," Cole finally said, his voice cracking slightly, reaching toward her. "I can explain everything, I promise you." She stood up slowly, her chair scraping quietly against the patio stones, and looked at him for a long moment before speaking. 4 years, she said quietly, her voice steadier than I expected. 4 years of watching you humiliate my mother at every single family gathering, telling me she didn't understand success, telling everyone that she should be grateful for your generosity, and you couldn't even manage your own finances honestly. "Marissa, please, let's talk about this privately." "You had 4 years to be honest with me privately," she said. "You chose this instead, every single time. I think it's fair that the truth came out the same way." She turned and walked toward me, and I set the folder down on the table and simply opened my arms. She stepped into them, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt my daughter truly let herself be held, without apologizing for needing it. The party ended quietly not long after that. Guests left in small, whispered clusters, glancing back occasionally toward the head table where Cole remained standing alone, his champagne glass finally set down, untouched. In the days immediately following the party, the full weight of what had happened settled over the family slowly, the way heavy weather settles over a valley. Cole tried, in the first week, to reach out to me directly, calling twice and leaving voicemails insisting that I had ambushed him, that I had deliberately humiliated him in front of his business associates, that I had no right to interfere in his marriage. I did not return either call. There was nothing left to say to him that the documents hadn't already said far more clearly than I ever could. Marissa, in those same early days, moved through a complicated mixture of grief and clarity. She grieved, understandably, the version of her marriage she had believed in for 4 years, the confident, successful husband she thought she'd married, the future she thought they were building together. But she also, for the first time in years, seemed to breathe more easily, no longer carrying the quiet, constant weight of covering for someone else's excuses. With Patricia's careful guidance, Marissa began the difficult process of untangling her finances from Cole's. It took several weeks of meetings, paperwork, and difficult conversations with the bank, but eventually, her credit and accounts were successfully separated from the loans Cole had taken out in her name without her full understanding. It was not a simple or painless process, but it was, at least, a solvable one, thanks to having addressed it early rather than years down the road when the damage might have been irreversible. Cole's finances, once the full truth became public knowledge among his business circle, collapsed with startling speed. 2 additional business relationships he had been quietly relying on to stay afloat dissolved within the month, once word spread through their small professional community about the unpaid debts and dissolved partnerships already on record. The downtown condo he had once bragged about owning outright went up for sale within 6 weeks, sold at a loss significant enough that he walked away from the transaction still owing money rather than gaining anything. The divorce process began formally within that same month. Cole, to his credit in at least this one respect, did not contest it once the full picture became undeniable even to him. Perhaps some part of him understood, finally, that there was nothing left to salvage from a marriage built so heavily on an image that could no longer sustain itself under any real scrutiny. Marissa moved, temporarily, into a small guest house on the edge of my property, not because she needed my money, and I made a point of never once suggesting that she did, but because she needed her mother nearby during those first difficult months, and because, for the first time in longer than either of us could remember, she let herself need someone without immediately apologizing for it. We spent many evenings that autumn sitting on my back porch, watching the sun set over the same fields I had grown up on, talking quietly about everything that had happened. Some evenings she cried. Some evenings she laughed, surprising herself with how quickly certain memories of the marriage now struck her as almost comically absurd in hindsight. Slowly, gradually, I watched my daughter come back to herself, the sharp, confident young woman I remembered from before Cole Bennett had ever walked into her life. One evening, several months after the party, Marissa asked me a question that I have thought about often since. "Mom," she said, sitting beside me on the porch steps as the sky turned orange over the western fields, "why didn't you ever tell me, all those years, how much you and Dad had actually built? Why did you let me believe we were just ordinary?" I considered the question carefully before answering, because it deserved a careful answer. "Because your father and I never wanted money to be the thing that defined how you or your brothers saw yourselves, or how you saw other people," I said. "We wanted you to value honest work, kindness, and character above everything else. And I think for the most part that worked. You grew up to be a genuinely kind, hardworking person, Marissa. I've never once doubted that. But it also meant," she said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud, "that I didn't have the information I needed to see Cole clearly. If I'd known what our family actually had, maybe I would have noticed sooner how much he was performing, how much of what he said just didn't add up." I nodded, because there was real truth in what she'd said, and I had turned that same thought over many times myself during those sleepless nights before the party. "That's something I've thought about too," I admitted. "I don't think keeping quiet about our finances made Cole who he was. I think Cole was always going to be exactly who he was, regardless of what you or I knew. But you're right that it might have taken you longer to see it clearly than it should have." "So what do we do differently?" she asked. "Going forward, I mean." "We stay honest," I said. "Not boastful, not showing off, but honest. If someone we love asks a real question, we give them a real answer. That's the difference between humility and hiding, I think. Humility means you don't need to announce what you have. Hiding means you're afraid of what people will do with the truth if they know it. Your father and I practiced humility, but maybe, without meaning to, we also let a little too much hiding creep in alongside it." Marissa was quiet for a long moment, watching the last of the light fade over the fields. "I'm proud of you, you know," she finally said, "for staying quiet all those years, even when he was awful to you. And I'm proud of you for finally not staying quiet when it actually mattered." I reached over and took her hand, the way I had done so many times when she was a little girl, frightened of thunderstorms or nervous before a school exam. "I'm proud of you too," I told her, "for finding your way back to yourself. That's the harder part, in the end. Anyone can survive a difficult truth coming out. It takes real strength to rebuild afterward, and you've done that beautifully." I think about that night often, the toast, the folder, the long silence that followed. Not with anger anymore, but with a quiet kind of peace that took time to settle into. I never wanted to embarrass Cole Bennett for the simple satisfaction of embarrassing him. I wanted my daughter to see clearly, in a moment she could never later rationalize away, in the quiet, forgiving hours of the night, exactly who she had built a life with, and exactly what that life had actually been built upon. But if there is one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it is this. The people who talk the loudest about everything they have are very often the ones most afraid that someone, someday, will discover exactly what they don't. And the people who stay quiet, the ones in plain cardigans, driving old trucks with mud still on the tires, bringing homemade gifts to birthday parties instead of expensive, showy ones, are very often the ones who have long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. I spent 4 years letting a man believe that my silence was weakness. It was not weakness. It was patience. It was my father's voice, still with me all these decades later, reminding me that numbers, given enough time, always tell the truth in the end. Marissa is doing well now. She has rebuilt her life slowly, carefully, entirely on her own terms, and she laughs more freely now than she did in those last 2 years of her marriage. She no longer flinches when someone casually asks what she's doing with her life these days, because she has finally come to understand, fully and completely, that her worth was never something Cole Bennett had any right to measure in the first place. As for me, I still drive that same old truck, mud and all. I still wear the same plain cardigans I've worn for years. I still bring homemade bread to every family dinner, wrapped simply in a clean dish towel, because some things are worth more precisely because they weren't bought. I learned a long time ago, sitting across a kitchen table from my father with his stack of yellow ledger paper, that the people who truly matter in your life were never judging you by your truck, or your cardigan, or your quiet little house, in the first place. And the ones who were, well, in the end, they were never really family to begin with, no matter what the wedding invitations or the anniversary parties tried to tell us. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who judged you by what you had instead of who you actually were, I hope this story reminded you of something worth holding on to. Quiet strength is still strength, even when nobody around you seems to notice it. Patience is not the same thing as weakness, no matter how many people try to convince you otherwise. And the truth, given enough time and enough patience, always finds its way into the light exactly when it's needed most. Thank you for listening to my story. And the next time someone looks down on you for driving an old truck, or wearing a plain cardigan, or living quietly in a small house on the edge of town, ask yourself gently what exactly they're so desperate to prove and why they need you to be smaller for them to feel tall. Because in my experience, the ones who are truly secure in who they are never need anyone else to be less in order for them to feel like more.